Have you ever noticed how some organizations just feel, well, fundamentally broken? Like everyone's walking around in this constant buzzing state of panic, exhausting, or turf warfare? We almost always blame the workload, but research actually points to something way deeper. So let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the underlying psychological structures of our work environments. We're going to trace our everyday office behaviors all the way back to human evolution and see how a trauma-informed approach to leadership might literally be the only way out of the modern corporate trap.
Let's kick things off with a pretty provocative question about human nature. Are we biologically destined to build these toxic, top-down power structures, or can we actually choose a different path? Anthropologist Christopher Boehm points out something fascinating. Biologically speaking, humans belong to a despotic species. Kind of like our African great ape cousins, we have this hardwired, innate drive to compete, to establish alphas, and to dominate each other. And yet, for the vast majority of human history, our nomadic hunter-gatherer ancestors lived in fundamentally egalitarian societies. So you really have to wonder, how did a despotic species manage to live as equals for so long? Well, philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau hit the nail on the head. He famously observed that our innate need for recognition and esteem often spirals into pure vanity, and that's what drives the creation of oppressive social hierarchies. Rousseau actually called this desire for recognition amour propre. It's that deep craving not just to be seen by your peers, but to be seen as distinctly superior to them. When that kind of vanity really takes root, it creates a social contract built entirely on domination. People who manage to secure that superior esteem end up building institutions, think of those rigid corporate ladders we're all so familiar with today, just to cement their status and hoard power. It's an absolutely wild contrast when you think about it. We have our biological classification as a despotic species on one hand, and on the other, the way our ancient hunter-gatherer ancestors actively, deliberately suppressed bullies to maintain equality. That egalitarian society wasn't just some happy accident, It was an active social contract. The vast majority of people simply looked around and realized they didn't want to be dominated by some bully, so they banded together, they enforced a moral ethos of autonomy, mutual aid, and shared power. They literally used collective action to keep the aspiring alphas in check. But fast forward to our modern world, and we've largely abandoned that egalitarian contract, just letting domination and hierarchy run rampant. Section 1. Trauma on the brain and its neurological impacts. When we completely ditch that egalitarian social contract and force people into modern dominating hierarchies, it doesn't just make them unhappy, it actually creates profound physical trauma. Slowing down to look at the neuroscience here is crucial. The stress of an oppressive environment literally alters brain structures, making it incredibly difficult for traumatized employees to even function normally. Your amygdala, the brain's emotion processor, goes into hyperarousal. That means employees are constantly fearful and irritable. The hippocampus actually shrinks under prolonged exposure to stress hormones like cortisol, causing memory fragmentation and deep confusion. And your prefrontal cortex? That's your logic center. When trauma hits, impulse control and focus just go out the window. We are literally asking people to innovate and collaborate while their brains are trapped in survival mode. Section 2. The 4 Trauma Responses, specifically the 4 Fs by Pete Walker. Now, this neurological damage doesn't just stay quietly hidden in the background. It manifests externally in the workplace as 4 deeply ingrained defensive structures, widely known as the 4 Fs. First up, we have the fight type. You'll probably recognize this one right away as the typical corporate bully demanding total control. It's ironic, really, because they unconsciously equate having power with being safe. They respond to any feelings of insecurity or alienation with rage and contempt. In the office, this is that manager who constantly monologues, intimidates their team, and demands absolute perfection. They're essentially using narcissistic defenses just to protect themselves from feeling vulnerable. Next is the flight type. And this one is tricky because they are often highly praised in corporate settings. But in reality, they're running from their trauma by becoming relentlessly driven, burned-out workaholics. This is the obsessive-compulsive defense. Their internal starter button is just jammed in the on position. They honestly believe that if they just achieve perfection, if they just stay busy enough, they'll finally be safe. And organizations often blindly reward this behavior, completely missing the fact that this superstar employee is actually sprinting away from profound emotional pain. Then we see the freeze type. This is the isolated employee who just completely checks out, avoiding interactions and numbing themselves to survive the daily stress. Think of it as the dissociative defense. Their starter button is stuck on off. In a high-stress hierarchy, they just camouflage themselves. They might daydream, constantly browse the internet, or isolate themselves from the rest of the team. They've unconsciously decided that human contact is dangerous, so they just hide in plain sight. Finally, there's the fawn type. This is the ultimate people pleaser who sacrifices their own well-being to serve an overbearing boss or a narcissistic colleague. It's the codependent defense. They basically abandon their own boundaries, rights, and preferences to merge with whatever a dominant figure wants. They are absolutely desperate to buy a little bit of safety by just making themselves incredibly useful, even if it completely destroys their own mental health in the process. I mean, seeing your workplace through the lens of those 4 Fs is pretty eye-opening, right? But identifying the problem isn't enough. We need a systemic cure. So let's shift gears from individual clinical psychology to actual organizational healing, leaning on some great research from institutions like Regent University. Section 3. Trauma-informed leadership as a modern egalitarian approach. The big takeaway here is that we must implement trauma-informed leadership. It acts as a modern egalitarian social contract designed to actively dismantle those toxic triggers we've been talking about. This framework is built on 6 guiding principles from SAMHSA, that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and these principles do something amazing. They shift an organization from functioning in a panicked emergency mode to operating with a consistent, grounding sense of compassion. It's a very active transformation. We're talking about establishing real physical and psychological safety, building absolute trustworthiness, and ensuring every single voice actually has power. It's about recreating that ancient egalitarian balance where everyone is respected and supported instead of dominated. To actually pull that off and successfully implement those principles, a leader has to embody 4 core attributes. They need to prioritize genuine human connection while maintaining a calming stability. First, you need authenticity, being transparent and actually modeling vulnerability. Second, you need massive emotional intelligence. You have to regulate your own stress so you don't end up re-traumatizing your team. Third is relational capacity, the ability to be highly intentional about building deep, inclusive connections. And lastly, resilience, staying adaptable to the chaos of work while keeping a steady, growth-oriented mindset. From those 4 attributes flow 4 active behaviors that a leader has to practice every single day to pull their team out of those fight, flight, freeze, or fawn responses. First, you have to actively understand the neuroscience we broke down earlier. Second, you must regulate distress by making sure your environment is actually safe, morally, socially, and physically. Third, you have to empower your people to make their own choices, giving them back that crucial autonomy. And fourth, you must practice emotional healing by actively validating their lived experiences. We've actually seen this final behavior, practicing emotional healing, modeled very visibly on the national stage during massive moments of crisis. For example, research highlights how President George W. Bush following the September 11th attacks and former President Donald Trump following an assassination attempt both utilized emotional healing. Now, despite entirely different contexts and political styles, both leaders validated the collective shock of their followers, expressed gratitude and resilience, and unified their bases in the immediate aftermath of trauma. Analytically speaking, this just goes to show that validating emotional reality is a fundamentally effective leadership tool when you're dealing with profound human distress. Section 4. Building compassionate workplaces and practical application. So how do we take all these massive concepts and actually put them into action on Monday morning? By adopting these 5 practical steps out of Loeb leadership, employees spend less of their energy scanning for threats and more energy doing high-quality work. And here's the really good news. You do not have to turn your managers into therapists. You really just need to make the work environment predictable. Clarify who owns what decisions and when things are due. When you see someone completely zoning out or snapping at a coworker, train your leaders to recognize it as a stress response, rather than just immediately punishing it as bad behavior. Do what you say you're going to do. Basically, build a system that doesn't just rely on individual good intentions, but actively embeds compassion right into how workloads are designed and distributed. Think of the Japanese art of kintsugi for a second. It's this beautiful metaphor. Much like broken pottery that's repaired with gold, trauma survivors are undeniably shaped by their experiences. But those fractures? They can become profound sources of wisdom and resilience when they are properly supported. A trauma-informed leader looks at an employee who has been through the ringer, and they don't see a broken cog in the machine. They see someone with unique adaptations, incredible survival skills, and immense value. When you pour the gold of safety, trust, and empowerment into those cracks, both the individual and the organization become stronger than they ever were before. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with one final pretty crucial thought. Will you continue the despotic cycle, or will you choose the path of compassion and equality? Literally every single interaction you have is a choice between feeding the toxic hierarchies that break our brains or building the trauma-informed spaces that heal them. So what kind of environment are you going to create tomorrow? Keep asking yourselves those questions. Keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.